Today, the Marvel Cinematic Universe is a global entertainment powerhouse with its 23 films grossing over $22.5 billion at the worldwide box office by 2021. But the origins of this world-conquering media conglomerate are actually quite humble. At one point, the Marvel we now know and love was nearly dusted from existence. So grab your shield, load up on your web shooters, and slip on your Infinity Gauntlet, because this is a story of the rise, fall, and rebirth of Marvel. Marvel's origin story starts in 1930s Brooklyn. Here, high school graduate Martin Goodman began chasing his passion for drawing and animation. For 3 years, Goodman worked for several emerging publishers, selling works to newspapers and pulp magazines. By 1933, Goodman launched his own pulp magazine, Western Supernovel, and began expanding into the emerging new medium of comic books. By 1939, Goodman created his own publishing company, Timely Publications, which oversaw various companies all operating out of the same offices. One of these subsidiaries was Marvel Comics. In October 1939, Marvel Comics #1 hit newsstands, debuting now famous characters like the Human Torch and Namor, the Submariner, an aquatic anti-hero who premiered a full 2 years before DC's Aquaman. It sold an astonishing 900,000 copies, securing the publication's future. Around the same time, a young artist, Jacob Kurtzberg, kicked around the streets of Brooklyn. For this son of Austrian-born Jewish immigrants, fistfights with bullies occurred daily. But with his tenacity, he never backed down. By his 20s, Jack and fellow artist Joe Simon pitched a new hero to Timely Comics, a character who embodied the fiery spirit and the genuine freedom of the country that gave Jack's refugee family a home. Jack, who changed his surname to the more American-sounding Kirby, pitched Captain America. Kirby would go on to establish the distinct visual style of Marvel Comics, as well as co-create nearly all of Marvel's most renowned characters, including the Hulk, Black Panther, Iron Man, and the list goes on and on. Around this time, Goodman also decided to hire his wife's mild-mannered 16-year-old cousin, Stanley Lieber, as an office assistant. Lieber eventually became interim editor of the comic line, a position he occupied for decades under his pseudonym Stan Lee. Lee eventually became the president and face of Marvel before his death in 2018, at the age of 95. Lee made over 20 cameos across all of the major Marvel film franchises. Following World War II, Americans lost interest in superheroes, leading Timely Comics to rebrand as Atlas Comics. Goodman dropped superheroes for emerging genres like horror, westerns, humor, and even medieval adventure and Bible stories. Though many of these titles and characters died off, giants like Thor and Ant-Man made their first appearances during this era. According to Lee, Atlas survived less because of quality and more because of cheaply and quickly produced content. As the world rolled into the 1960s, DC Comics had experienced a revival of some of their better-known heroes. Instead of simply relying on their individual stories, however, DC ventured into something entirely new, packaging their top-tier heroes into one series, the Justice League of America. Seeing the success of this endeavor, Goodman ordered Lee to produce not just one character, but a team of heroes that could replicate Justice League's success. In response, Lee formed his own super team by enlisting Kirby. Together, they emerged victorious, revolutionizing superhero comics in the process. Their heroes wouldn't be godlike characters of the DC pantheon. Instead, they would be flawed, squabbling, bickering, and eschewing their secret identities in favor of celebrity status. Instead of fictional cities like Metropolis and Gotham, they would live in places like Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York City. In November 1961, Marvel Comics introduced the Fantastic Four, the series that founded the Marvel Universe and put Lee and Kirby on the map. Fantastic Four established Marvel's reputation for emphasizing characterization and more mature themes to a greater extent than their predecessors. These characters would have struggles, doubt, and even unclear motives. Some of the characters even looked more monstrous than heroic. The Incredible Hulk symbolizing the dormant monster lurking within each of us. The Marvel method attracted not just kids, but more mature adults and college-aged individuals who craved their multi-layered storytelling. Lee recognized that most fictional heroes were adults and wanted to develop a superhero that young readers could relate to, full of angst and uncertainty, struggling to balance personal desires with greater responsibilities. Lee, together with artist Steve Ditko, eventually landed on something that was truly special. And in August 1962, Amazing Fantasy #15 debuted The Amazing Spider-Man. By 1965, both Spider-Man and the Hulk were featured in Esquire magazine's list of 28 college campus heroes, next to real-life figures like John F. Kennedy and Bob Dylan. By 1968, Marvel was selling 50 million comic books a year, ushering in what would become known as the Marvel era of comic books. In 1972, Goodman retired, installing his son Chip as publisher. Before long, Lee succeeded him as publisher and also became Marvel's president, though only briefly. The 70s saw another slow season for the comic book industry. Once again, Marvel diversified into their other genres, horror, sci-fi, even movie tie-ins like the now legendary Star Wars comics. Marvel managed to surpass DC in 1972, but by the mid-1970s, a decline of the newsstand distribution network slowed sales. Still, Marvel made their way through the decade, altering comic book culture with them. The 1980s saw continued market fluctuation, but by and large the company motored on. In December 1986, New World Pictures acquired Marvel Comics Group and Marvel Productions, giving birth to Marvel Entertainment Group, releasing The Incredible Hulk Returns in 1998, a continuation of the TV series starring Lou Ferrigno. The following year, the Marvel Entertainment Group was swallowed up once again by McAndrews and Forbes Holding, overseen by Ronald Perlman for $82.5 million. Perlman called Marvel a mini Disney in terms of intellectual property, stating that Marvel was now in the business of the creation and marketing of characters. 2 years later, Perlman took MEG public, but instead of being a blessing to Marvel, Perlman's approach made him more like Galactus, destroyer of worlds. Perlman emphasized branding and merchandise. In 1993, Marvel acquired 46% of Toy Biz, transferring their CEO Avi Arad to the position of CEO and president of Marvel Entertainment, hoping to streamline Marvel action figures and films. Perlman was also behind the formation of Marvel Studio, one of the only bright spots in his otherwise dark tenure at Marvel. However, Perlman decided he wanted to buy the rest of Toy Biz shares and merge it with Marvel to create a money-making behemoth, a move that didn't sit well with investors. Expensive Marvel toys weren't selling, due in no small part to the utter lack of Marvel films. There were some movies, but let's just say they were a far cry from what we now expect from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Adding to their troubles, renowned Marvel writers and artists Todd McFarlane, Rob Liefeld, Eric Larson, Jim Valentino jumped ship to form Image Comics to produce their more edgy and gritty titles free of the Comic Authority's restraints. In general, the whole industry slumped throughout the 1990s. In a diabolical last-ditch effort, Perlman filed for bankruptcy so that he could merge with Toy Biz without the approval of the stockholders. This last move in a long series of bad decisions caused Marvel stock to tank. Now collapsing under a mountain of debt, Marvel reluctantly pawned off its beloved characters to any studio that would have them. In 1997, Toy Biz bought Marvel Entertainment Group to end their bankruptcy, forming a new corporation, Marvel Enterprises, and bringing stability to the comics line. Stan Lee was appointed chairman of Marvel Studios and formed a 10-year movie release plan. Then, in 1998, out of the shadows, an unexpected hero pulled Marvel Studios out of the pit and put them on the road to redemption. The cult classic Blade, based on a third-tier, relatively unknown but also cheap Marvel character, grossed over $70 million in the US alone, bringing a glimmer of hope to the once great comic legend. The new Millennium saw a series of pivotal decisions. In 2004, Marvel hired David Meisel as COO of Marvel Studios, who took out a $525 million loan contingent on Marvel's success. Failure meant relinquishing control of 10 Marvel characters, including the Avengers. When talks with Universal Pictures failed, Merrill Lynch attempted to squash the deal with Marvel. But by 2005, Marvel struck a distribution deal with Paramount Pictures, preserving the rights to Iron Man, Thor, and Black Widow. In 2007, Marvel made one of the most critical decisions in their company's history, promoting junior executive Kevin Feige, who had worked on X-Men and Spider-Man films, to president of Marvel Studios. 1 year later, Marvel's 70-year history hung on one film, Iron Man, starring Robert Downey Jr., whose stints in rehab and jail had dented his once sparkling career at the time. But like Tony Stark, Marvel had no choice but to rescue themselves using their own creativity. The film exploded, earning a whopping $585.3 million globally, eventually leading to an acquisition by the Walt Disney Company in June of 2009 to the tune of $4 billion. Feige's shrewd creative decisions, genuine love for the characters, and vision for an interwoven cinematic universe allowed Marvel Studios to assemble one of the largest, most lucrative film franchises in history, now worth more than $17 billion. As of 2021, Marvel has announced a dozen new TV shows for the Disney Plus streaming service, service, as well as 13 new films for Phase 4 of the MCU. Like a true hero story, Marvel has faced trials, even dancing with utter defeat. But because of its beloved, sincere, larger-than-life characters, they re-emerge more powerful than ever.